It was a conflict with almost no casualties. An insurrection in which the government may have briefly teetered but never came close to toppled. On paper, the Whiskey Rebellion that took place in the US from 1791 to 1794 can look almost singularly unimpressive, a minor, if intriguing, historical footnote. A case study in both government overreach and the right of federal courts to punish insurrection. Nothing more. Yet, it's only from our vantage point, over 200 years later, that the Whiskey Rebellion seems so minor. In the hot, dangerous summer of 1794, it seemed like the sort of grand catastrophe that would rip the Union apart. Triggered by an unfair excise tax on whiskey, the rebellion saw parts of western Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley explode. Tax collectors were assaulted, homes burned down, gun battles fought between scores of men, finally culminating in a 7,000-strong army gathering to torch Pittsburgh. An army that came scarily close to ending the American experiment before it had even truly begun. As 1791 drew to a close, it was on a United States of America that was just beginning to embark on its great voyage through history. The Constitution had been ratified 3 years earlier. The same year our story begins, the Bill of Rights had officially become law, thereby kicking off 2 centuries of totally calm and rational debate about what exactly the phrase "to bear arms" means. But arguing over amendments wasn't the only great American tradition that began in 1791. Thanks to Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, popular anger over unfair taxation would also become fashionable. The United States, you see, was drowning in debt. To fight the British in the Revolutionary War, the colonies had blown through some $25 million in loans, a huge sum in those days. As part of the process of forming a consolidated nation, the federal government had assumed that debt. That meant that the Treasury was now footing the bill, which meant Alexander Hamilton was in charge of paying off those war-related costs. Hamilton's solution? Taxes. With the war over and everyone now having representation, the founding father assumed that meant they were also going to be cool with taxation. So he began increasing import duties and sketching out plans for a land tax. But when the latter stalled and the former set the merchant class complaining, Hamilton was forced to uncover new sources of revenue, the biggest of which was whiskey. Back in this era, the average American consumed 6 gallons of alcohol a year, far higher than the 2 that regular folk guzzle today. With much of that coming in the form of hard liquor like whiskey, a tax on booze could bring in up to $800,000 annually. What's more, Hamilton was pretty sure he could do it in a relatively painless way. By putting the tax on manufacturers rather than consumers, the Treasury Secretary envisioned only small costs being passed on to citizens, an estimated $1.50 a year for the average family. And with whiskey far from a necessity, it would be easy to argue that the tax was virtuous, discouraging sin even as it helped pay off government debts. But Hamilton had made the classic policymaker mistake of designing something that sounds great on paper but disintegrates into mere papery mush on contact with, well, messy reality. Nowhere was the reality messier than on the western frontier. In 1791, the vast bulk of Americans lived in the east, 96% of the population clinging to the coasts and foothills that lay eastward of the Appalachian Mountains. The remaining 4% lived across that barrier, a barrier that cut them off from the capital, Philadelphia, not just physically, but also psychologically. Out here in the Ohio River Valley, life was tough. People were mostly farmers, mostly operating at a little above subsistence level. There was hardly any cash, which meant a barter economy, trading items for goods and services. The most tradable item of all was whiskey. With Philadelphia so remote and hard to get to, the idea of lugging grains over 250 hard miles in order to make some cash seemed as absurd as trousers made of custard. Much better to convert those leftover grains into liquor. Not only was it lighter, 1,200 pounds of grain could be reduced to just 160 pounds of whiskey, but it sold better and didn't spoil en route. More importantly, that whiskey could also be bartered back home. With no currency to hand, farmers would pay for goods with their distilled whiskey, or they could use it as down payment on supplies. Even clergy in western Pennsylvania received part of their salaries in liquor. because it was so useful, it wasn't just large manufacturers who were making it. Everyone from smallholders to rural families owned at least one still. Families who were now in the crosshairs of Hamilton's tax. But it wasn't only the pain to their pocketbooks that would make them react badly. It was also political alienation. With Philadelphia so hard to get to, these Westerners found the new Congress about as remote and unaccountable as guys like Hamilton had once found London. They didn't feel represented in the slightest, and they only need look at recent history to see how best to respond to taxation without representation, and that's with revolution. While those on the frontier may have felt alienated from Congress, that didn't mean some congressmen weren't on their side. When Hamilton proposed his new tax, there was the mother of all political storms. In debates that raged like literate hurricanes, the growing Jeffersonian wing blasted Hamilton's Federalists. Georgia Congressman James Jackson declared that people had the right to get drunk and proposed an alternative tax on lawyers. Others demanded that Hamilton press forward with a land tax instead. Yet others asked why a whiskey tax that would hit those in western Pennsylvania, but not a tax on New England favorites like beer. In the end, though, it would be one man who decided the debate. At first, George Washington was wary of Hamilton's plans. Already worried about a growing divide between the eastern majority and the tiny western minority, the commander-in-chief preferred not to make all the farmers fuming mad. But then he took trips to Virginia and Pennsylvania and wound up changing his mind. Wherever the president went, local officials were super into the idea of taxing whiskey, so much so that Washington returned to Philadelphia and promptly told Congress, "Guys, let's do it." In March 1791, Congress made the whiskey tax official, empowering Hamilton to set up a nationwide system to collect the money. But Washington, just like Hamilton before him, had made a classic politician mistake. Just because local officials are all for something doesn't mean the people they represent are, especially when your new tax is as badly designed as Hamilton's was. To list all of the problems with the whiskey tax would take the rest of this video, and it would be about as exciting as, well, discussing taxes. So, we're just going to hit the major flaws, but what flaws they were. The first issue was that the tax was regressive, meaning that the more you produced, the less you had to pay. This had the perverse effect of leaving the large whiskey manufacturers able to cope, but the small-time farmers who distilled on the side stuck with enormous bills. The second was a legal requirement to register every still, with huge fines in place for those that didn't comply. As you'll recall from our last chapter in today's video, most families in the Ohio River Valley owned a still, and most of them used it for making their own liquor, which they occasionally then bartered for goods. All of them were now on the hook for this new tax, and since they only rarely sold what they made, they couldn't just pass this cost on to consumers. The third major problem was that the tax had to be paid in cash. We've already noted cash was rare out on the frontier, but with the government now demanding hard currency for each still, low-income families were forced to scrape some together or face being dragged 300 miles from home to attend court in Philadelphia. Because apparently this wasn't bad enough, those taken away to face trial would have to pay their own expenses in the capital, and they better even not dream of paying in whiskey. For those in western Pennsylvania, it was about as apocalyptic as it could be. A tax so unfair and damaging to their barter economy that it's tempting to think Hamilton held some sort of unspecified grudge against Keystones. So, they did the only thing they could. They rebelled against the new regime. But first, the rebellion was non-violent. A refusal to pay the tax here, a few hundred unregistered stills there. But the federal government wasn't going to let Hamilton's cash cow slip away easily. By summer, they'd hired a swath of local officials and charged them with going systematically from place to place to collect the money. As opposition grew, those against the tax began to organize. Poor farmers and landless workers, mostly with Scots, Irish, English, or German backgrounds, began to congregate at places like the derelict Redstone Old Fort. Calling themselves the Whiskey Boys, they started laying down plans to obstruct the tax collectors, to ensure they weren't targeted by this oppressive government. It wouldn't take long before these plans spiraled into violence. Over the summer of 1791, letters started arriving at the homes of distillers in western Pennsylvania and in the wider Appalachian region. Sent by the Whiskey Boys, they supposedly contained instructions on fighting the new tax. But under the surface, they also contained a warning. One it didn't take a genius to figure out. If you complied with this new tax or helped in its collection, you would be treated as a collaborator. And if that happens, you better pray to God to help you, because no one on earth would. It was the start of a sweltering summer of tension that occasionally boiled over into violence. Often that violence was simply against property. Those who obediently registered their stills, for example, would often find those stills smashed up. Sometimes, though, it targeted humans. Robert Johnson was a local tax collector who had the distinct misfortune of being the first recorded victim of that violence. On September the 6th, 1791, he was riding past Pigeon Creek, Pennsylvania, when a group of 16 women surrounded him. Only it turns out these women were actually whiskey boys in disguise, and Johnson was dragged from his horse, stripped naked, shaved bald, and tarred and feathered. Although he survived the attack, Johnson was left burned and humiliated, forced to walk miles naked in order to find help. Nor was he the only one to suffer such a miserable fate. Despite their disguises, Johnson recognized two of the men who'd assaulted him. He reported them, and a man named John Connor was sent to arrest them. Only this John Connor turned out to be way less confident than his fictional counterpart, because he too wound up tarred and feathered, as well as being tied to a tree. It was the beginning of a string of similar attacks. Over the following year, more tax collectors were targeted as the protests swept across the Appalachian Mountains. More men got to know the painful horror of having hot tar dripped on their bodies. Because, make no mistake, tarring and feathering was really horrible. While the pine tar used in those days became sticky at 60 Celsius rather than the literal boiling temperatures of modern-day asphalt, it could still leave nasty burns, not to mention psychological scars. Yet at this stage at least, the growing rebellion wasn't killing anyone. Even as militias formed to shield communities from the tax, the violence still remained in hand, which may explain why George Washington was so lukewarm about combating it. Across the first half of 1792, Alexander Hamilton repeatedly hammered the need to meet violence with violence. In his mind, this was a direct challenge to the federal government, one that needed to be met with force now before it could mushroom into something even scarier. But Washington didn't agree. Rather than raise his own army to march on western Pennsylvania, the president preferred to send in negotiators. When the rebellion's leaders refused to meet them, he settled for a presidential proclamation urging people to cease the attacks and start paying. Yet nothing, he said, made any difference. People in Pennsylvania were mad as hell, and they weren't going to take it anymore. As fall of 1792 gave way to the bitter cold of early 1793, a whole new level of violence began to rise. No longer content to just tar and feather tax collectors, the rebels began burning the homes of revenue officers, burnings that soon spread to the farms of those who collaborated with law enforcement. In one notorious incident, the excise officer Benjamin Wells had his home attacked not once, but twice. The first time, he was out and his wife was beaten in his place. The second, he was at home and, well, you could probably guess the rest. Each time an incident like this unfolded, judges issued arrest warrants for those involved. Each time, eyewitnesses were intimidated into staying silent. Each time, the sheriff sent to execute the warrants were either too scared or too sympathetic to the rebels to act upon them. As the new year got underway with the frontier still in anarchy, the rebellion began to move away from its protest roots. It assumed a political dimension. In western Pennsylvania, citizens called their own assembly to act in place of Congress. While many just wanted the central government to take them seriously, others pushed in crazier directions, far crazier directions. With France, at the time in the middle of the Reign of Terror, some began to advocate an alliance with Paris, or maybe annexation into Imperial Spain, anything that might help them take this rebellion to its next logical step: war. An all-out war that would cleave the newborn US clean in two. In any good revolution, you always need to have that guy. You know the one, the guy who looks at the dumpster fire of resentments and goes, my gasoline would look amazing on this. In the Whiskey Rebellion, the role of that guy fell to John Neville. A veteran of the Revolutionary War, Neville had gone on to become a powerful landowner and tax collector, and a guy who was all about cracking down hard on anyone owning a still. So, when Federal Marshal David Lennox appeared in western Pennsylvania in July 1794 looking for someone local to help serve writs to 60 distillers, Neville was all like, "I am your dude." The writs couldn't have come at a worse time. Just a month before, Congress had revisited Hamilton's tax, hoping a few tweaks could stop the unrest. The biggest tweak was that local courts could now try those who refused to pay, meaning they no longer had to be hauled off to Philadelphia, further meaning they would be judged by sympathetic juries. The trouble was, Lennox wanted to serve his writs before the tweak took effect, in essence inflicting maximum pain on the rebels while it was still legal. It was this dumpster fire that Neville would soon douse with high-grade rocket fuel. The flames started flickering on July the 15th as Neville led Lennox to the home of a distiller named Miller. Instead of finding him there, they found an armed mob demanding they stop serving writs. There was a tense exchange which ended with the government men riding off unharmed after someone fired a musket into the air. But rather than give up, Neville then spent the day ensuring other distillers got their writs. The result was that Neville returned to Bower Hill, his grand home, already anticipating violence, to such an extent that he armed his slaves and told them to await his command. The next morning, right on cue, an angry crowd gathered outside his property. Neville's reaction? He grabbed a gun and shot a guy dead. Then he called his slaves, who drove the crowd off in a brief, bitter gunfight. It was at this point that the Pennsylvanian dumpster ignited. By killing a man, Neville had massively upped the temperature. Rather than scatter, the large angry mob went and whipped up an even larger, even angrier mob. On July the 17th, 500 men marched on Bower Hill, thirsty for blood. Neville tried to call out to the state militia to help, but only 10 or so turned up. The rest were marching with the rioters. And so we get to the only real battle of the Whiskey Rebellion, the Battle of Bower Hill. It was a battle John Neville had no intention of taking part in. As the mob closed in, the dumpster arsonist went and hid in a nearby ravine, leaving militia leader James Kirkpatrick to try and talk the crowd down. Instead, the mob declared it would allow the women inside to be evacuated, and once that was done, open fire. For the next hour, muskets cracked, sending tiny puffs of smoke across Neville's property, smashing window panes and chipping the brickwork. Amazingly, only one person was killed, the leader of the mob, James McFarland. But others were injured, and the house, the barn, and slave quarters were all destroyed when the rioters set them on fire. More importantly, the battle nearly triggered a full-blown insurrection. With Neville and the militia having killed 2 whiskey boys, it started to look like the script to the Revolutionary War was being played out all over again in quadruple time. They'd just had the Boston Massacre. Now, it was on to the battles of Lexington and Concord. We use this comparison not just to be facetious, but as a reminder that nearly everyone taking part in this lived through the Revolutionary era. For them, overthrowing a government wasn't something to drunkenly talk about at the bar, but something they'd actually done. So why not do it all over again? Within days of the Battle of Bower Hill, an army of 7,000 rebels gathered in a field outside Pittsburgh. There, they listened to radical speeches from guys like David Bradford, speeches about how the federal government would soon lash out, so they needed to strike first. With rumors swirling that they were going to torch the city, panicked officials sent an appropriate peace offering: 6 barrels of whiskey. Remarkably, this intervention worked. Rather than destroy Pittsburgh, the rebels got drunk and partied into the night. But a drunken mob is still as potentially dangerous as an angry mob, and officials nervously wondered how long they could keep the Whiskey Boys from taking the step into outright war. Luckily for them, the federal government was about to beat the rebels to the punch. It took the threat of Pittsburgh burning to rouse George Washington from his slumber, but to the president's credit, once he woke up to the issue, he really woke up to it. In the wake of the battle, Washington went to the Supreme Court and presented them with evidence of insurrection. That September, Justice James Wilson ruled that the Militia Acts of 1792 authorized a military response. And with that, the president went about raising an army. It was a dicey move. By now, people in the West were so het up over the tax there was no telling what they'd do. As one worried politician told Hamilton's closest aide, "Should an attempt be made to suppress these people, I am afraid the question will not be whether you will march to Pittsburgh, but whether they will march to Philadelphia." In other words, people were seriously terrified any war might end with the US government being overthrown. But what chance did Washington have? It was one thing to be soft-handed about enforcing attacks everyone knew was weapons-grade bullpoop. It was another to ignore a gigantic mob threatening to torch cities and align with revolutionary France. That September, the president used his emergency powers to summon militia members from eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia, and Maryland. Before long, he had around 13,000 men under his command. On September the 25th, Washington gave a speech officially declaring a military intervention. 5 days later, Washington and Hamilton climbed into a carriage together in Philadelphia and set off to do battle. Remarkably, for a country that has made so many military men its leader, this remains the only time a sitting president ever led troops into battle, unless Joe Biden did something really crazy in the time between us recording this video and it being published, but we're just going to say it's unlikely. But while General Washington was absolutely ready to fight, it wouldn't be necessary. No one had yet realized it, but the Whiskey Rebellion had already reached its high-water mark. As news spread of the massive federal army bearing down on them, the Whiskey Boys faced a choice: to fight back and risk a real war, or to back down and sheepishly admit that things had gotten out of hand. And it seemed nobody was willing to risk a real war over whiskey. As ringleaders started to flee U.S. territory, morale in the rebels collapsed. By the time Washington arrived to meet the remaining commanders at Carlisle, Pennsylvania on October the 9th, it wasn't determined insurrectionists he found waiting, but a bunch of scared guys who looked like kindergarteners sent in to see the principal. In a pathetic display, they told Washington they accepted his authority and would stand down. Just to be sure, Washington had his troops occupy the region, yet no violence flared. Faced with a bigger, more powerful foe, the Whiskey Rebels had simply broke and fled. With the threat evaporated, Washington returned to Philadelphia. He left Hamilton in charge of his army and ordered them to stay on for a couple more months in a show of force. But Hamilton wasn't content to simply ride around giving everyone a stern warning look. These farmers were the guys who'd crapped all over his shiny new tax plans, who'd made the federal government look weak, who'd given his authority a ringing slap around the face. No, Hamilton wanted to make sure these idiots cosplaying rebellion leaders had learned every action has its consequences. On November the 14th, a wave of arrests broke the cold night. Doors were kicked in, suspected rebels dragged from their beds. By the end of the so-called dreadful night, over 150 men and boys had been taken away. So outraged was the local community that they took to hanging Hamilton's portrait upside down, and to this day, some whiskey distillers in West Pennsylvania still do so. Although it made much of a difference. After whittling the 150 down to just 20, Hamilton returned to the capital, forcing the rioters to march all 300 miles to Philadelphia. They arrived on Christmas Day to a crowd that booed and taunted them. It was the beginning of the rebellion's final act, the act Hamilton had been waiting for ever since poor Robert Johnson got tarred and feathered in 1791, the moment when the government got its revenge. In the end, the trials of the Whiskey Boys lasted until summer 1795, and rather than a show of government authority, they were a massive disappointment. The main problem was that all the ringleaders had fled, leaving only a few sullen rioters without the means or brains to escape into Spanish territory. Of those, only 10 had enough evidence against them to actually go to trial, and 8 of them were released after that evidence failed to hold up. At last, only 2 remained, 2 unlucky bastards named John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, who had the misfortune to have multiple witnesses willing to place them at the Battle of Bower Hill. That summer, they were both sentenced to death, the first Americans to be convicted of treason since the United States became a fully formed nation. Yet, despite Hamilton's desire to show everyone who was boss, Mitchell and Weigel would never receive their punishment. For that, we can thank George Washington. The rebellion over, a war averted, the president seems to have gotten squeamish about the idea of executing these low-ranking nobodies. Twice over the next few months, Washington issued stays of execution before finally bowing to what conscience told him to do. On November the 2nd, 1795, Mitchell and Weigel received presidential pardons. Shortly after, in his State of the Union speech, Washington explained his thinking, saying, "It appears to me no less consistent with the public good than it is with my personal feelings to mingle in the operations of government every degree of moderation and tenderness or which the national justice, dignity, and safety may permit." And so, the only people ever convicted of taking part in the Whiskey Rebellion walked away free. And with that, the first serious challenge to the federal government's authority came to an anticlimactic end. But that doesn't mean the issue of the tax itself was settled. While 1795 dudes were all like, whoa, I guess this means Hamilton and the Federalists won. It was a short-lived victory. For the next 7 years, the tax remained on the books, but it also remained hard to collect, mired in the same sort of passive disobedience that had marked its first few months in 1791. What was collected was far short of the $800,000 per annum Hamilton had originally budgeted. Some sources contend it wasn't even enough to cover the costs of putting down the rebellion. Finally, in 1802, the era of the whiskey tax ended for good. 2 years earlier, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans had swept the Federalists from power. Now, President Jefferson repealed the tax, summing it up with the words, "The first era was to pass it, the second to enforce it, and the third to make it the means of splitting this union." Sadly for Alexander Hamilton, he lived long enough to see the tax he had invested so much political capital in vanish into the dustbin of history. Today, the Whiskey Rebellion occupies a curious place in American history, neither fully one thing nor another. On the one hand, it was a miserable failure. There were almost no actual battles, hardly anyone died, and the rebels crumpled the moment Washington showed up with a real army. On the other, it still constituted the biggest American insurrection prior to the Civil War, and one in which perpetual themes of government overreach and personal liberty openly clashed. Yet to our minds at least, neither of these takes is quite right. Instead, we should remember the Whiskey Rebellion not for what it was, but for what it could have been. The moment when history hesitated at a fork in the road and nearly took the path leading to the possible breakup of the United States. It's fascinating, isn't it, to think how often we have these moments, how often we tiptoe to the edge of a precipice only to step back at the last second. The stories when we don't go falling over the cliff may be less dramatic, but they're worth remembering, if only to remind us next time just how close we came to disaster.